Hello, I like Pikmin 2. Wow, that's pretty amazing. And unfortunately, one of the largest videos on Pikmin 2 that's ever been produced is rife with factually, provably wrong information, horribly incorrect takes, and lots of bad stuff. It's not a good video. In fact, I would say it is probably the worst Schafrillas video, whatever, that's ever been released on his channel, at least that I've ever seen, and that at least is still public. So we're going to be going through all of the wrong things to hopefully correct some of the misinformation and terrible takes that were popularized because of the video.
Oh, wait, what's that? There's no co-op in the main campaign? You implemented co-op into the game via the side modes, but not the main story for some reason?
Okay, so the first negative point that is actually mentioned in the video, it takes about 3 minutes for them to actually make an initial point, is the fact that you can't play co-op in the main campaign. And the thing is, which is something that they'll harp on later in the video, you have a limited amount of time to accomplish things within Pikmin. Having 2 people split screen being able to do tasks at twice the amount of things would trivialize and completely ruin the balancing of the game. Now, do I really think that they cared about that balance at Nintendo? No, I don't. They could have easily implemented co-op, but there are plenty of arguments for why co-op would have been a bad idea, especially when it came to the overworld segments, which are inherently time-based. In the very least, it's a neutral thing. You being able to have 2 different captains naturally increases the amount of strategy and different puzzles that can be made from Pikmin 1, so this isn't really a negative, just an opinion, and that's perfectly fine.
The most immediately apparent downgrade to talk about when comparing Pikmin 1 to Pikmin 2 is the story. Pikmin 1 offers a simple narrative that nonetheless manages to hook you throughout the entirety of the admittedly very short game. The stakes are extremely high and they make you want to see Olimar's quest through to the end. It's a really compelling motivation, a classic story of survival. Pikmin 2, meanwhile, has crippling debt. The president sells off your ship to partially repay the loan, which is cool. I love the fact that the ship we painstakingly rebuilt over the course of the previous game is now just gone. That's awesome. But as it turns out, a bottle cap souvenir Olimar brought back for his son is worth some money. So the president immediately sends you back to the Pikmin planet with Louie in order to collect more random items that they can sell and repay the loan with. Olimar doesn't even get a chance to see his family again. He's immediately shipped back off to the planet he almost died on. I know the Pikmin series isn't an example of avant-garde storytelling, but doesn't this sour the ending of the first game a bit? You know, knowing that our quest to rebuild our ship and see our family again resulted in the ship immediately getting taken away from us, and the family reunion we fought so hard for getting postponed until after we went back to the hostile alien planet to get some Skippy's peanut butter. Well, Shafrillas, you may be saying, obviously Nintendo is making a statement on how capitalism drains people of their lives and makes them unable to hold functioning relationships or accomplish anything outside of their work. I mean, sure, it sure is showing that. Doesn't really explore it that much outside of Olimar complaining about his boss or his work schedule a few times in the Piklopedia. The fact that Olimar is forced to return to the Pikmin planet immediately in order to raise enough money to rectify Louie and the president's mistakes is just kinda cynical and depressing. But this is still incredibly weak compared to the first game, where story and gameplay worked hand in hand to drive you and make you want to experience each area and find each ship part. The collectibles in Pikmin 2 are cool and fun to come across, but they feel less rewarding to collect because the goal they're leading you towards is far less compelling.
Alright, so this criticism has 3 different prongs generally to it, and it's over how compelling the story of Pikmin 2 is compared to Pikmin 1. However, even though this is an opinion, there's still a lot of things that I think are indicative of Schafrillas' misunderstanding of both Pikmin 1 and Pikmin 2's story. And that is the dark humor of it all. As disturbing as Pikmin 1 and 2 both are, they're both kind of sapped in this black comedy, this dry wit, this dry humor that is very, very prevalent. So, in Pikmin 2, for example, you're collecting all these treasures which reduce your debt, which he says is less compelling than collecting the ship parts to get off the island. However, if you remember correctly, in Pikmin 1, many of the ship parts that you do to get back off the planet aren't even actually important or vital. There's things that have completely nothing to do with your survival. Tons and tons of parts for the ship in Olimar, and getting the good ending and getting out and collecting it throughout the story are self-admittedly not actually necessary for survival. And so part of the comedy of Pikmin 1 is that in this super dark scenario, he's spending time collecting useless garbage. Pikmin 2 is a natural extension of this dark comedy then, sending you back to recover the debt on this deadly planet that almost killed you, just to collect random garbage that you don't understand or like that much, but you have to try and make sense of, which you see from Olimar's interpretations of the different things he picks up. It's just weird to say that Pikmin 2's treasures are less compelling whenever they're naturally more interesting to see Olimar's interpretations of them, and whenever Pikmin 1's things aren't even actually for his survival most of the time. That's part of the joke of Pikmin 1, like one of the main jokes in Pikmin 1. Pikmin 2's story is a natural evolution on Pikmin 1's dark humor. It's evolving on it. It's like Borderlands 2 to Borderlands 1, in a sense. Keeping the same underpinning humor that went through the story, but elevating it to another level. I mean, he even complements the humor of the Piclopedia in Pikmin 2, something that is exclusive to this game in the series, at least until some of the additions in Pikmin 3 Deluxe.
And nowhere is that more evident than with the removal of the 30-day time limit. Now, I understand that this was a divisive aspect of the first game, and that the stress of getting everything done within 30 in-game days alienated a ton of players. But in my opinion, that's kind of the main appeal of the game. Pikmin wouldn't be Pikmin without that urgency. But I don't know, I guess enough people didn't like it, so Nintendo decided to get rid of the time limit entirely in the next game. You can spend as many days as you need.
Okay, so the time limit is not gotten rid of, at least not in any sort of meaningful sense. The time limit still exists in Pikmin 2. Sure, the time limit from a story perspective, having 30 days, is removed, but that time limit isn't actually the time limit. That's the day limit. The time limit, the thing that actually creates the gameplay loop and strategy for each day in Pikmin, is still the exact same in Pikmin 2. The reason that you have a limited amount of time per day is because it gives you a limited amount of time to come up with a strategy to get a piece back to your ship. That's the fundamental gameplay loop that's being used in Pikmin 1, 2, and even 3. So it's really weird that he would talk about it being removed. Another one of his points here is that he talks about the cave system not having a time limit, but he fails to mention that there's a different type of limit placed upon you inside the cave system. That is a limit of Pikmin themselves. You see, in a normal day in Pikmin 1, 2, and 3 in the overworld, you have a limited amount of time to do what you want to do. However, you have an infinite amount of Pikmin, theoretically, to do. You can destroy enemies, you can get rid of things and pull out more enemies from your onions of previous days. You can do that sort of stuff. In caves, you can't. The most you can do is manage the resources you have with the Pikmin you have and hope that you'll find little flowers that help you either change Pikmin from one type to another or otherwise increase the amount of Pikmin you have very slightly. This becomes more tense as you get to the later levels and more tough cave systems, as really, really deep sublevels will sometimes have water hazards or other types of hazards that will limit you from getting very important treasures. This is the type of limitation that's being placed upon you in Pikmin 2, and I think it's a fair exchange that actually spices up the gameplay variety compared to just having a time limit, which Pikmin 2 still has. Shafrillas acts like lacking a story reason for limiting the amount of days somehow trivializes the actual gameplay of having days and night cycles. But this isn't the case, because the story reason for not being able to go out at night in the overworld is still the same.
But like, if that's the case, then what's the point of the day system? You're probably saying, well, they can't just remove the day system because that's how the first game worked. And it wouldn't make sense if you could just spend infinite time in an area all of a sudden. But you can do that in the dungeons! Why does time freeze all of a sudden the moment you go underground? How does that make sense, Nintendo? Okay, I'm getting ahead of myself. I should save this for later.
So yeah, since he said that he was going to get into that later, I'm also going to get into that later, but I sort of already explained that. You still have the time limits because the fundamental gameplay loop is coming up with a strategy to move one thing to another and a limited amount of time. That strategy remains the same, and if you don't get things done in time, then you start to see the overworld regress in the progress that you've made, such as bridges undoing themselves with different bugs and all that sort of thing. As for why time slows down or stops, which is again just a story reason, not a gameplay one, I will also get into that later because it's pretty interesting and I think has a fairly decent explanation behind it.
If they wanted something less restrictive than what the first game had, Pikmin 3 figured it out with the juice system. Basically, you also have infinite days in Pikmin 3, unless you run out of your juice supply, which can be replenished by nabbing the game's main collectibles, fruit. Bada boom, there's still urgency, but there's also not a hard deadline to conform to. I know it's not really fair to fault Pikmin 2 for not doing something that its sequel got right, but at the same time, removing the time limit and the urgency entirely was such a massive miscalculation.
So once again, this doesn't remove the urgency entirely, considering that you still have a limited amount of time to get certain things accomplished per day. Just because you have a limited amount of days to do it, I don't know how bad he is at Pikmin 1 and Pikmin 3, but even as a child, I was able to finish Pikmin 1 with half of the days remaining. There really wasn't anything beyond a superficial level of urgency. And in Pikmin 3, and I'll admit I played that whenever I was older, Pikmin 3 also has it to where you can get 3 or 4 different fruits in a day and then suddenly be set up for life, basically, for the next 10 to 12 days. You have even less pressure to get less things done in Pikmin 3 than you do in Pikmin 1 or 2. It's just superficially laid out in a story sort of sense.
It's still a fun time, but that's unfortunately only about 20% of the game. It's time to talk about the biggest problem with Pikmin 2 and my least favorite aspect of the game in general. The dungeons. I really cannot stand the dungeon system in Pikmin 2. Before we get to that, however, let's briefly discuss the overworld. I say briefly discuss because you're not going to be spending much time up here compared to underground. Pikmin 2 has 4 main areas, which at first glance seems like a step down from the original's 5, but considering how 2 of the 5 areas in the original were incredibly small, with one serving as a simple tutorial area and the other being little more than a final boss arena, I'd say the general landmass you explore between the 2 games is about the same size. Some of it is even about the same shape between the 2 games. Hey, wait a minute. Yeah, Pikmin 2 blatantly reuses the map layouts from Pikmin 1, and I'm pretty mixed about this. On the one hand, while the layouts are the same, the actual stuff you'll find in these familiar locations is different, and that's kinda cool because it showcases how ever-changing nature is. On the other hand, what, it changed this drastically between Olimar's round trip to Hakatate and back? I don't know, this planet's weird, I guess. More importantly though, the fact that only one overworld area in this game is completely original, and the other 3 are just remixed versions of areas from the first game, yeah, I shouldn't have to explain why that's a bit disappointing.
So this is another kind of weird thing to mention because he talks about them basically being remixed versions, but so much stuff is actually changed between the areas that they act out fundamentally completely different. In fact, whenever I was a kid, I didn't even recognize that they were the same level until I was probably halfway through the game. Now, granted, I was a stupid kid, but even playing them now, I have a hard time sometimes placing exactly how they're supposed to be positioned in the past few years. On top of that, he talks about how you're only going to be spending like 20% of the game above ground and that, oh, barely any of the game is above ground, but then immediately follows that up by saying it's around the same size as the first game in terms of above ground. So you're kind of sneaking an admission that Pikmin 2's above ground area is as much content as the entire first game, except for it now has an additional 80% below ground. Now, the thing is, with Pikmin 2, if you don't want to get 100% completion, you also aren't required to do most of the underground segments, meaning you're given a lot more freedom and exploration in this game than you are in the other games. He also fails to mention how much more variety there is between different things you can pick up, different monsters you can fight, and different above-world bosses and mini-bosses. It just overall seems like a very moot point that could really go either way.
But it's still easy to tell that corners were a bit cut here. But that's okay.
It's really weird to say whenever all of the graphics and everything, all the art assets, all the new enemies, everything are completely different from the other games, that the corners were somehow a bit cut. Even when you yourself admit earlier in the video that there's been a complete overhaul in a lot of the graphics and the visual appeal. If they've completely overdone everything and changed the consistent model but just kept the levels vaguely similar in certain aspects, how is that cutting corners? Especially whenever you admit that from Pikmin 1 to Pikmin 2, 80% of the game, which I'm not even saying is accurate, but that's what you said in your video, 80% of the game is below ground. So you're saying that they were able to completely reroute this, and also if you take the amount of bosses between Pikmin 1 to Pikmin 2, being multiplied in terms of the amount. It's just a really, really strange thing to say is obviously corners being cut. I mean, you have 3 extra types of Pikmin, counting the Bulbmin, in this game. You have over 200 treasures versus 30 in the original game. It's really strange to say that corners were cut just because a creative decision made it so that the main 3 areas are reworked seasonal variants, with substantial differences, mind you.
But it's still easy to tell that corners were a bit cut here. But it's still easy to tell that corners were a bit cut here. That corners were a bit cut here. That corners were a bit cut here. The vast majority of your playtime will be found in a brand new dungeon system. So what could possibly go wrong? Oh, you know, just about everything, basically. First of all, aesthetics. I really hate the look of a lot of these dungeons. It's like they took a look at the Forest Navel, the ugliest area from Pikmin 1, and said, yeah, this is the aesthetic we need more of in the sequel, for some bizarre reason that scientists are still trying to uncover to this day.
So this is kind of fun because he compares one of the 3 major stages in Pikmin 1 to the aesthetic of all the Pikmin 2 dungeons that he's now crapping on. This makes it so that while in criticizing Pikmin 2, he's actually decreased the amount of levels that are considered good-looking by his own standard in Pikmin 1, making that 2 areas.
There are other visual themes at play here, like Rust. There are some rusty dungeons, so that's nice and definitely not really ugly. There's also a shower floor theme, which still doesn't look the greatest. And okay, to be fair, there are some nice looking ones, like the snow-covered caves or the ones that are designed to look like a child's play area. But for the most part, I really don't like the way these areas look, which is made even worse by the fact that you spend way more time here than you do in the pretty places. And sadly, my aesthetical preferences are the least of the dungeon's problems.
Okay, so the aesthetic preferences are completely understandable. I'm not going to criticize somebody for having an opinion that's different from mine. I will admit that I do like the overworld areas a lot more than I like the underground areas in terms of aesthetics. However, I do think that there's a lot more variety than he's playing on here, and there's a lot more variety in general in just the dungeons of Pikmin 2 than there is in the overworld of Pikmin 1. First off, many of these dungeons that he mentions and has different things actually have full-on set pieces and different things. For example, there's a whole train set in one floor of Glutton's kitchen. Then there's one of the levels that has a breakthrough where you go up a tree to see light coming in through like the middle of a tree trunk before diving down deeper. I'm not going to give a lot of specific examples because I don't want to hunt for footage, but nearly every single dungeon, despite being mostly randomized, actually has tons of unique set pieces that make almost every sublevel unique in some sort of way.
But then there's the more major issue. As I mentioned earlier, time just doesn't progress at all when you're in the dungeons, which is so bizarre. Literally, how and why can you jump into one of these holes, spend as long as you want down there, and then pop out with no time passing in the overworld? They never make any attempt to acknowledge or explain this. I guess it would be too hard to justify time passing down there from a gameplay perspective, but it's so bizarre and it breaks the rules of the universe and the entire premise. Pikmin is supposed to be about time management, and yet the vast majority of this game completely forgoes this key element of the original. That's stupid. I know the time limit stressed a lot of players out, but maybe all that means is that real-time strategy games aren't for them.
So once again, you still have as much time management in Pikmin 2 as you do in Pikmin 1. You just have tons more game in Pikmin 2. You just also have the underground segments. Now, just because there's no time limit specifically in the underground segments doesn't mean that you're now not an RTS game. In fact, you're getting more RTS strategy. It seems really weird that he just comes up with this straw man of someone who doesn't like the time management feature, whenever the only thing about the time management feature he seems to care about even in the slightest is some nebulous story way that it's time management. The actual time management, the actual RTS elements of the game and story, he doesn't seem to care about at all. The dungeons are actually offering a gameplay variety. It's allowing you to understand more aspects of the RTS genre, because instead of time being your main limiter, you are instead limited by the amount of units that you can use. In other RTS games, they generally go by the name of units, but in this, obviously we're talking about Pikmin. Because you can't go back to the onion without restarting the entire dungeon, you have a limited amount of Pikmin to use in those dungeons, meaning you're getting more variety in the type of gameplay experience you're getting, all rooting from a limited amount of resources in RTS. RTS, after all, is based on real-time strategy. Unable to pause whatever is happening in the current situation, and you're having to come up with ways to use your limited resources, whether that be time or units, to come up to different solutions or achieve your goals. Him getting really angry about this and pretending like Pikmin 2 has made this big affront to the general premise of Pikmin 1's gameplay is patently ridiculous, considering it plays almost identically. He's making an unfathomably inconsequentially small thing into an extremely large thing by virtue of just overemphasizing it and stretching how big of a deal it is.
Stupid. I know the time limit stressed a lot of players out, but maybe all that means is that real-time strategy games aren't for them. And that's okay. There's tons of other less stressful games for them to go play.
So this is really weird because he's basically saying if you like Pikmin 2 more than you like Pikmin 1, maybe RTS isn't for you. Maybe Pikmin isn't for you. This wasn't a good game. If you prefer this to Pikmin 1's gameplay, if you prefer having less of it, maybe you're just not into RTS games. But like, Pikmin isn't just an RTS game. Pikmin is an entirely unique franchise that is completely different in a lot of interesting ways. Asking them to be less interesting and less novel and then just tell those people who like that more, maybe you don't like RTS games, is really, really strange. It's a completely disgusting and weird straw man that doesn't help anyone or help your argument.
Feel the need to cater to people who don't like real-time strategy games by removing the real-time strategy elements of a real-time strategy series. I mean, that's just common sense, you know?
And once again, they didn't remove the real-time strategy elements. It just removed the hard time limiter, which is something that is not even present in basically any other real-time strategy I can think of. Having a specific amount of days limited to do different things in real-time strategy is pretty much unheard of in most real-time strategy games, and most real-time strategy games that I've seen are mainly player versus player dealing with armies. So Pikmin, from its inception, was already very different than a general RTS game. Why would they start catering to that market now, since they never have?
I'm just so fundamentally disappointed with the kind of game Pikmin 2 chooses to be for the majority of its playtime. And the best part is, we're not even close to being done with this dungeon discussion. There's also the issue of how samey and repetitive the dungeons feel, especially as you play the game for longer and longer. From a gameplay perspective, each one is the exact same. Not a single dungeon offers anything unique from a gameplay perspective compared to the others. Not a single dungeon offers anything unique from a gameplay perspective compared to the others.
So this is super goofy, because if you think about what he said for even 2 seconds, you realize how ridiculous it is. Not a single dungeon offers anything unique from a gameplay perspective from the others. Well, yes, it does. Each dungeon has different layouts and specific set pieces and hazards and all those sort of things. Those are the gameplay differences. If those don't count as gameplay differences, then Pikmin 1 doesn't offer a single gameplay difference between any of its levels. Pikmin 2's overworld, Pikmin 3's overworld, none of them have any gameplay differences from any of their other levels. It makes no sense. The difference that you see in these games is the hazards that you have to strategize around in real time. And the real-time strategy hazards are obviously different in different dungeons, because he mentions just moments earlier that some dungeons are focused around spiders, some are focused around snagrets. There's also lots of falling hazards, and he'll be complaining about different types of hazards he doesn't like later. So it's just really weird to make this big grand claim that they don't have any gameplay differences. The aesthetics are different, the hazards are different, the layouts are different, the set pieces are different, everything about them are just as different as anything you'll face in any of the other Pikmin games. So goofy man moment. He's being a goofy man who didn't think anything about what he was actually saying.
But I played through all of them anyway, as if an actually cool, unique gameplay mechanic would just fall right out of the sky. Ha ha, fall right out of the sky.
So this is really funny because he's about to talk about the water wraith, which he considers to be a very unique element, but he also shows in the moments before bulbmen, which are ultimately extremely unique from a gameplay perspective, and something that are not only unique to Pikmin 2, but unique to Pikmin 2's dungeons, and only very specific ones at that.
There is actually one dungeon in this game with unique gameplay mechanics compared to all the others: the Submerged Castle. Not only is this the one dungeon in the game that restricts you to a certain type of Pikmin, in this case blues, but if you spend too much time on any floor in this place, you end up spawning the Water Wraith, a relentless, invincible hunter that wants nothing more than to steamroll you and your Pikmin, instantly killing them. Suddenly, time management matters again in one of the dungeons, and there's constant fear and tension. You want to grab the treasures and then get the fuck out as soon as possible before this unholy Lovecraftian horror shows up to massacre you and your beloved little troops.
So he's right here that time management does become important again. However, something fun that he didn't really mention is the fact that the time limit doesn't actually come back. You never see a time limit, and in theory, you could spend an infinite amount of time on any of the floors in the Submerged Castle. There are even obviously places that you can use to escape, or lure them away to different places. But for some reason, he actually counts this as a time management system. And I think that's just because there's an increased sense of urgency where there isn't otherwise. But increasing a sense of urgency and danger alongside limited resources is just combining the overworld and underworld mechanics in a more abstract way. It isn't reintroducing the time mechanic, it's just combining the two that we already had. Not to say that that isn't awesome. The Submerged Castle is one of the most iconic and cool places in any of the Pikmin games, and definitely scarred me as a child. But it's just very strange that he would make an exception for this, although I'll take the compliments where I can.
If the other dungeons had some sort of special gameplay hook like this one, then I'd be a lot more positive on the dungeon system and the game overall. But no, unfortunately, this is the one exception to the rule about all these dungeons feeling incredibly samey and generic. You might have noticed that I haven't really talked about the level design of these dungeons yet, and there's a very good reason for that. You see, there is no level design. No, seriously. The floors of each dungeon are randomly generated. Each floor is always assigned specific treasures, enemies, and other goodies, but every time you reset your game, the layout of the floor will be different, and all of these elements will be in different spots.
So this is sort of a half-truth. Whenever he says goodies, what could you possibly mean by goodies? Well, I doubt that he means set pieces, and that's one of the most major things that do remain the same. So, one of the things that he complained about was it not being as replayable, but this is the only game where things can actually be somewhat randomized. At the same time, though, there is level design because because there are unique set pieces only used on individual floors that have completely unique assets and strategy, especially if we look back at what I mentioned previously, like Glutton's Kitchen with the train station. There's a lot of different bread bugs that'll grab stuff and try to steal them away from you. Just because aspects of each sublevel are randomized, pretending that the whole thing is just a big goobly gulch is incorrect.
I honestly kind of hate this, quite frankly. It makes the layout so uninteresting because no human thought was put into the treasure locations on each floor.
Okay, let me go back to that real quick. So this thing right here, where you see the 6 different tubes, and it says that there was no human thought put into any of these sublevels, because he happens to show something that on this floor appears every single time you reset it. It doesn't matter how the world resets on this sublevel, you will always have this specific asset with the 6 different pipes. Now, are these 6 different pipes something that I find truly inspiring compared to other dungeons? No, but it's interesting to say that obviously there was human thought put into it. Just because there's randomized elements doesn't mean that there aren't unique and interesting structures that are constantly put in through literally dozens and dozens of floors.
There could be treasures that spawn in the water that you can't get if you don't have enough blues, but then if you just reset the game, suddenly the treasure isn't in the water anymore. I know there's a ton of games with procedurally generated areas that are super popular, and I can obviously see the appeal of that sort of game, but I don't really think it works here since the randomization doesn't change the gameplay in any meaningful ways. You're always going to find the exact same treasures and enemies on each floor. The only difference is that those treasures and enemies weren't paired with any coherent or compelling level design.
So this is really funny because this floor that he's on, exactly, as he's talking about there's no thought put into the level design, this floor he's put on is identical every single time. The specific enemies that are there, because this floor is mainly just one giant room. This is one of the few examples where you reset every time, it's actually the same. And this is where he sort of overemphasizes here. He finds something that he doesn't like, and then he overextends the amount of things that he can say negative about it by reaching into things that are just blatantly untrue. Even in the footage that he chooses to cherry pick about the game, he actively is showing footage that disproves his own points.
Coherent or compelling level design. Plus, even though some people might enjoy the fact that no 2 playthroughs of the same floor are exactly alike, I don't know, I don't really remember 90% of the floors on my previous playthrough, so why would I care if these forgettable areas have slightly different layouts the second time around?
And here's another example of him cheapening his own previous points just so he can overextend his current criticism. He says that he doesn't care about the replayability that's gained from having the levels change every time because it's a slight difference. So his previous thing was that they're completely random and that there seems to be no thought or will put into them. And now he's saying that they're only slightly different. These are contradictory opinions to hold. In truth, the unique and interesting assets are kept the same on each level, but having a slight difference is a good thing, if anything. If it's truly not that much of a difference that it actually changes the level design all that much, then there shouldn't be much to complain about from where he's sitting.
I nonetheless strongly disliked their inclusion, and I'm beyond thrilled that they removed them entirely from Pikmin 3. If you like them, there's no harm in that, obviously, but just from my personal standpoint, they go against practically everything I love about the Pikmin series. The real-time strategy elements, the gorgeous environments, the push and pull between completing your main objective and trying to get your Pikmin numbers up. Since, oh yeah, I forgot to mention, you can't grab more Pikmin while you're in these dungeons unless you stumble on one of these Pikmin multiplication flowers. Hope all your Pikmin don't die when you're down here.
So here he is criticizing the main intended strategy element of the dungeons, and not even realizing it. He's mockingly going, oh, I hope you don't run out of Pikmin. Oh, since you can't grab them, what were they thinking? What were they thinking? They didn't put things down here so you could get more Pikmin? They were thinking about making a real-time strategy where you have limited resources and you have to strategize around that limitation, aka the entire point of the genre.
But maybe all that means is that real-time strategy games aren't for them.
If I was Shafrillas, this is where I would tell him what he said earlier.
But maybe all that means is that real-time strategy games aren't for them.
And that's where I think this video kind of irritates me, because he'll go back and forth between saying things that are provably false, and then saying, oh, but this is just my opinion, it doesn't matter. But whenever you state an opinion, and then back it up with something that is provably false, it's something that can be wrong. You know, there's a difference between saying, this is my favorite strawberry, or I don't like strawberries, and saying strawberries aren't fruits. It's something you can research. You can go to the information. You can look at the genes. You can look at the scientific research on it. Strawberries are fruits. You can't say strawberries aren't fruits. That's just my opinion. That's basically what he's doing here.
But maybe all that means is that real-time strategy games aren't for them. If you like them, there's no harm in that, obviously, but just from my personal standpoint, they go against practically everything I love about the Pikmin series.
And this is where it's kind of annoying how coy he's being. He's saying, oh, I don't really care if you like it. I just think that it completely betrays the entire purpose of the thing. Like, okay, well, obviously you care if someone has a different opinion if you think it betrays the entire concept of the thing that you like, apparently. There's no reason for you to posture and pretend to be like that, although, I don't know, maybe that's why his videos do better, because he has this fake sense of, like, bipartisanship. But no, it doesn't betray anything from Pikmin 1 or Pikmin 3, and isn't indicative of some sort of bad thing in Pikmin 2. He's failed to substantiate any of these things.
I mean, it's okay, I guess, because as long as you have a few purples, you can basically decimate any enemy in your path. That's so cool. Let's talk about difficulty now. Pikmin 2, too hard of a game or too easy of a game? Rather than being a well-balanced experience in terms of its difficulty, I feel like this game honestly just uses really cheap methods to make the game both easier and harder at the same time. I would say the harder stuff outweighs the easier stuff a bit, however, so let's talk about that first. This game is a fucking lunatic with the amount of difficult shit it throws at you. I guess the least egregious of the new insta-kill hazards would be electricity, since it's always easy to spot and you can plan ahead and not take your Pikmin near it. Even so, if you end up near an electric gate with any Pikmin who aren't yellow, zap! Insta-death. It does at least give yellows a lot more tangible use than they had in the first game, but it still feels like a cheap new addition regardless.
Okay, so his first thing about the difficulty is that electricity is an insta-death, and even though you can see it at a good distance and understand it, it feels cheap to have them die instantly. This is really strange. I don't see any sort of problem with that. You've got a clearly choreographed hazard, and the hazard is very deadly, and if you interact with it, then you die. Okay, well, there doesn't seem to be anything poorly balanced about that whatsoever.
Remember bomb rocks? Well, guess what? They don't work for you anymore. Now they're just insta-kill hazards that are dropped by the new, incredibly annoying careening Dirigibug enemy. Or better yet, they can just fall right out of the sky. Ha ha! Fall right, I wanna die. Of course, bombs randomly spawning out of the sky is actually rather generous compared to some of the other shit the sky can spew out.
But this criticism is kind of playing with the word randomly and how it's being used. Either randomly out of the sky means they could literally randomly fall at any moment to any place, which is false and not true. However, randomly in terms of you don't know where they're going to fall, okay, that's true. However, you can just avoid any of these random encounters by careening around the area ahead of time, or by having flower Pikmin and smaller factions, which generally makes the process a lot quicker and easier, and also adds to the strategy difference between having fast-moving flower Pikmin and slow-moving leaf Pikmin. In other words, giving more usefulness to a differentiation between them, which was kind of taken out in Pikmin 2 as they got mostly rid of tripping. Tripping being something extremely annoying and terrible and awful and bad and obnoxious from Pikmin 1, which was a randomly occurring mechanic that could happen at any point that would cause Pikmin to die for no reason. Having obstacles that require quick reaction time and quick Pikmin to avoid them makes a lot more sense from a balancing perspective than having a completely random tripping effect that mostly affects leaf Pikmin. This is actually a balancing improvement from this game in basically any way you could look at it.
Try that shit with giant insta-kill rocks. Good luck making sure your entire squad of 100 Pikmin gets away from the huge looming rock shadow.
Okay, so why would you be running around a level in the darkness never having gone through there before with an entire group of 100 Pikmin? That sounds like you're being really stupid in regards to your strategy. You know, real-time strategy is supposed to be about getting through areas that are dangerous, observing your threats, getting through. Obviously, if you run guns a-blazing with everyone and your mom and your grandmother behind you, something bad is going to happen. You have to observe the area beforehand to see what sort of risks are around the corner. You playing in a non-strategic and reckless fashion isn't the game's fault. And even then, the game is very forgiving. As he already mentioned the reset function, you get an autosave at the beginning of every single sublevel. So if you ever do too bad or make too big of a mistake, you can just hit the reset button and redo it. However, the game does maintain some of its difficulty because if you reset it, then it'll slightly change the layout. So not only does it increase replayability and offer a certain amount of forgiveness to players when they mess up, but it also offers the experience as fresh, so you can't just train to become really, really good at the exact same way that you get through the level. Once again, in almost every way, this is a balancing improvement.
The traps on these dungeon floors are fucking absurd, and they don't feel like they were fairly balanced in the slightest. They instead feel like cheap ways of artificially upping the difficulty through unfair Pikmin deaths, and they're made even worse by the fact that the areas you encounter them in are so cramped and tight that it's incredibly difficult for your entire squad to avoid these hazards. Are so cramped and tight that it's incredibly difficult for your entire squad to avoid these hazards. For your entire squad. Okay,
so once again, he's just complaining. He's not actually making any sort of logical point here. To give him the same amount of charity he's giving other Pikmin fans.
But maybe all that means is that real-time strategy games aren't for them. Then there's enemies like the Ball Bear, a roided out Bulborb who's incredibly difficult to kill, and the Gatling Groink who laser death beams your Pikmin at any opportunity. And it almost seems random whether they'll just get stunned or insta-killed. Now, these enemies wouldn't be the worst thing in the world, except some twisted f*** at Nintendo decided, hey, what if when you kill these guys, they can come back to life after a short time, meaning you now have to worry about dragging their carcasses back to your ship so they don't come.
So this is really funny. I'm just going to pause before he's done talking. This is really, really funny to say because he specifically talks about how, once again, there's no gameplay differences between different sublevels and different dungeons. And once again, this is an entirely unique and interesting mechanic that adds urgency. It's literally everything positive that he was saying doesn't exist in the game, but now he's framing it as a negative. Having enemies that are extremely dangerous, that will slowly come back to life if you don't quickly get their body back to where they're supposed to be, that adds a certain level of urgency that can't be taken away from the game. Certain amount of urgency that requires you to move through the level quickly, so if you haven't already cleared a path back to your base, then suddenly it's a big threat. This is everything that he wanted. This is everything he was complaining about the game not having, but now he's framing it as a negative because this is where he decided to put it in the video. This goes farther to give the vibe that he just started writing negatively about Pikmin 2 and didn't actually proofread his script or come up with any sort of structural reason. He actively contradicts most of his points throughout his own video.
Now, you might be thinking, well, Shambapalupalaphasis, it sounds like you're just bad and you don't like hard games. Nah, man, I don't mind hard games as long as the challenge is fair and well-designed.
Well-designed is just sort of being put forward as a elusive term that allows him to say that it's bad because it's bad, because all of the things that he said in regards to fairness are not true or easily avoidable in ways that he's not mentioning. And so the, oh, you're just bad, being strawmanned out is kind of unfair on his part. Because, yes, actually, he is just bad. There's nothing unfair at play, and the only quote-unquote bad design is, once again, an opinion that he can't substantiate.
Pikmin 2 isn't like that because the challenge often stems from random insta-kill elements.
Quote-unquote random elements are not actually random in the sense that they could happen at any point in time. They're actually set pieces in the level that you can go ahead of time to fix and figure out. What he shows in this exact clip, even with the white Pikmin, is something that he himself made a mistake about. And insta-kill? I mean, if you don't kill an enemy in time after a Pikmin is eaten, then those Pikmin die instantly, too. Almost all hazards in Pikmin are insta-kills. You getting stunned is sort of a blessing.
And yet, despite all of that, there's still an argument to be made that this is the easiest Pikmin game. The existence of everything purple. Let's start with Purple Spray. One of the new features added to Pikmin 2 are these special berry plants with little red and purple berries. If you take enough of these berries back to your ship, you can get red and purple spray. But then there's the Purple Spray. Use this on enemies and they instantly turn to stone, meaning you're free to annihilate them before they break out. While it's pretty fun to do this to an obnoxious enemy giving you trouble, it's also incredibly cheap and lame.
You can only really do this to one, maybe two enemies at a time with a single purple spray, and it actively takes a lot of time to actually get purple spray in the game. Occasionally, they can be extremely nice rewards as optional places and dungeons that you didn't have to go to for treasure. But yeah, they do make the game easier. The thing is, though, they're not just handed out like free candy. They're something you have to work for. They're something that are used as rare rewards. They aren't something that's very common.
Turns out the best way to deal with a Ball Bear or Gatling Groink is to just not engage with them at all. Turn them to stone and wail on them. They won't even leave a body behind, so you don't even have to worry about them coming back to life. How nifty!
He's stating an active strategic variety in the game as something negative because of its strategic variety. Like, oh, it turns out that you can strategically use this specific thing on this specific thing to get rid of the negative aspect. Yes! It turns out you can use red Pikmin on fire hazards so that they don't catch on fire. Like, I'm not going to say that as a negative thing. That makes no sense, but that's what he's doing here with Pikmin 2. Can you believe that electric Pikmin don't die when they're shocked by electricity? Oh, that ruins the point. It's ridiculous. This is game balancing, making something that is more good, more difficult to obtain.
Look, I really do appreciate that there's an easy way to dispose of these obnoxious twats, but this kind of just feels like an automatic win button. It's just not really fun for this to be the most practical solution to deal with these guys.
So this is a very interesting thing. I'm not going to crap on Pikmin 3. I think Pikmin 3 is a great game. However, if you're talking about strategy and difficulty from any sort of objective analysis, Pikmin 2 is more balanced and more difficult, more detailed, more strategic, more variety than Pikmin 3. In Pikmin 3, you have the dash button that you can instantly use to basically kill and rush any enemy. That's literally a win button for most enemies in Pikmin 3. So saying that something is like a win button in Pikmin 2, whenever something easier exists in the sequel that you are praising over it, it just seems very contradictory.
The worst part about purple spray is that you can just farm obscene amounts of it by spending in-game days collecting purple berries, basically rendering most enemy encounters null and void.
This is really goofy because he mentions the fact that to get purple spray, you have to spend multiple days in-game farming it. Okay, so days and days of standing around in-game waiting for purple spray. So a day in Pikmin 2 is 13 minutes long, meaning that if you want to get maybe 1, maybe 2 purple sprays in a day, depending on how many flowers you have access to, you're going to spend basically 13 minutes for 1 to 2 uses. Meaning to grind with some of the amount of sprays that you see him with in later levels, he will have literally spent maybe hours and hours of his time doing this. Just because you can infinitely bash your head against a wall doesn't theoretically mean that it's the wall's fault when you get brain damage. The game actively balanced a certain amount of invested time around not letting you have too many purple sprays. If you're just willing to waste all of your personal real-life time getting purple sprays, that's not the game's fault. If anything, that's the game saying, okay, you're willing to do this obscene time sink because clearly the game is too difficult for you, we'll allow you to do it. Hey, editing hiding here. I'd also like to mention, just to further emphasize how crazy stupid this form of logic is, this is basically an argument against any level up in a JRPG. In Bloodborne, you can grind enemies to overlevel yourself so that the bosses become easier. Does that mean that the entire concept of leveling up is poorly balanced? No. Of course not. Offering more freedom. It's giving you a difficult, more annoying option to get past a more practical, obvious solution.
There's a reasonable cap on the amount of purple spray you can hold at a time, like somewhere between 5 to 10 uses of it, then it might be a fair and worthwhile inclusion. But instead, it's absurdly game-breaking, and I'm glad they took it out when making Pikmin 3. But the purple spray doesn't even hold a candle to the absolute size of this absolute unit, the purple Pikmin. Unfortunately, balance goes out the window entirely when talking about combat. Purple Pikmin essentially invalidate every other type during most enemy encounters. Remember Bulborbs? Remember how they were kinda dangerous in Pikmin 1 if you didn't kill them immediately when bum rushing them or throwing Pikmin on their back? Or how about Wollywogs? One of the most deadly enemies to encounter in Pikmin 1 because of their insta-kill ground slam attack. Yeah, well, in Pikmin 2, it's easy. Just throw a couple purples on these guys and you're fine.
One of the Wollywog footage that he shows are Wollywogs in water. This is something that still happens in Pikmin 2, of course, and purple Pikmin can't help you. You can't just spam enemies with purple Pikmin whenever they are in water hazards or behind certain other types of hazards, like poisons. There are still ways that the game has balanced out certain things to keep you from using purples in specific areas.
It's kind of embarrassing, really. And you can employ this strategy of just chucking some purples on most enemies in the game. Even ones where it would seem like other Pikmin would be better for it. Whoa, fiery blowhogs? This looks like a job for the Reds, who are immune to fire. Actually, no, the purples managed to kill him in the time it took me to say that sentence. Little electric beetles? The yellows would be pretty good for actually no, as long as they're not actively shooting electricity. You can kill these beetles a lot quicker and easier with purples.
As long as they're not spewing electricity. Well, that's the thing, though. If you throw them and they accidentally start using electricity, they instantly die. And then how are you going to get purples again? You're going to have to traverse back to a different dungeon, go all the way down in multiple floors, and then get into certain flowers to get rid of some of your other Pikmin. That's the thing. You have an additional risk whenever you use purple Pikmin that you don't have when using other Pikmin. So even though they're more useful, if they die because of your recklessness, they're going to be more difficult to get back.
It makes nearly every enemy encounter so brain dead since you don't have to engage with them in any meaningful or strategic ways.
You mean like most encounters in Pikmin 3?
But Shimbapaloopa Rafalupa Dadadualalysis, you may be saying, you were just complaining about how hard the game is. Why aren't you welcoming this thing that makes it so much easier? Well, because this isn't really addressing most of the cheap shit the game throws at you in order to raise the difficulty through the roof. Yeah, purple Pikmin are helpful at dealing with annoying enemies like the Bulbear and Gatling Groink, but they can't do a thing against the cheap traps that fall from the sky in just about every dungeon. They make it so one half of the gameplay is insanely easy baby shit, while the other half is merciless slaughter. And like, call me crazy, but I don't consider that to be good difficulty balancing. Both are frustrating in their own unique ways. And if you want to remove the easiness by just not using the purples in combat, then congrats! You're playing fair against the game, but the game isn't playing fair back. Since now you get to deal with insanely difficult bullshit enemies on top of the other bullshit that you can't do anything about.
He still hasn't substantiated anything that's actually unfair in the game, other than just things that personally irritate him and he doesn't like doing.
On top of the other bullshit that you can't do anything about.
So, you might notice that he's now throwing in things like insanely bullshit enemies, but he hasn't actually talked about any enemies that are bullshit in terms of how they operate or act. Unless he only means enemies that fall from the sky in very specific sublevels of dungeons, as he mentions in the clip afterwards. But that seems like he's then just over-exaggerating in his words and hoping that the people haven't actually played the game.
But the aspect of this game that irritates me more than anything is a single one of its 200 treasures, and the criteria needed to collect it. So, here's the thing about purples and whites. You can't get them the normal way, where you carry pellets or enemies back to an onion. Nah. These Pikmin are special. You can only get them in the dungeons when you find one of these candy pop buds. Toss a Pikmin of any color in, and they come out as purple or white. Since this is the only way to get these Pikmin types, your numbers of them probably aren't going to be as large as your red, blue, and yellow numbers. Now, you'd think this would be a good way to balance purples since they're rarer and you can't get a ton of them. But no, it doesn't really balance them since you don't need a ton of purples to kill an enemy. And even if you have a large squad of purples, they're still slow and can't deal with hazards, meaning you still need the other Pikmin for non-combat encounters, and most people wouldn't take a full large squad of purples with them as a result. So, since this whole candy pop bud bullshit doesn't do anything for the game balance, I kinda wish these guys got their own dedicated onions instead of...
What? How? How do you post a video?
So, since this whole candy pop bud bullshit doesn't do anything for the game balance, I kinda wish these guys got their own dedicated onions.
Just because it doesn't take a lot of purple Pikmin to destroy a enemy doesn't mean that it doesn't do anything for the balance to not have you obviously have 100 of them at all times. Do I even need to acknowledge how patently ridiculous that statement is? Just because the thing that you're using is effective for its purpose means that you shouldn't have to have any limitations on said thing. What? What? I gotta re-listen to this.
They're still slow and can't deal with hazards, meaning you still need the other Pikmin for non-combat encounters, and most people wouldn't take a full large squad of purples with them as a result. Toss a Pikmin of any color in, and they come out as purple or white. Since this is the only way to get these Pikmin types, your numbers of them probably aren't going to be as large as your red, blue, and yellow numbers. I think this would be a good way to balance purples since they're rarer and you can't get a ton of them, since you don't need a ton of purples to kill an enemy.
And yeah, you don't need a ton to kill an enemy. However, if you use them too frivolously, you'll end up getting them killed a lot easier. And if you can't have that many around with you in your party, having the limited amount of purples you have with you, especially in dungeons, die, makes it so that their usefulness is extremely important. Having them move really slowly also makes them more susceptible to death from other enemies. It's like he mentions all of the things that are being balanced and then just doesn't put them together.
You still need the other Pikmin for non-combat encounters, and most people wouldn't take a full large squad.
All the things that make them overpowered? Bad. All the things that make them underpowered? Bad.
The old shake weight right here is the bane of my existence whenever I replay this game, because it requires 100 purple Pikmin to...
Okay, let's be real. You introduce a Pikmin type that can cover 100. If you played Pikmin 1 or Pikmin 3, the first thing you'll think is, oh, what's the heaviest thing I can lift? The allure, the childlike allure of having 1,000 Pikmin heaviness is just like, so fun! And once again, as he mentions, this is a completely optional thing. If anything, if they didn't have something for 100 purple Pikmin as like a super secret extra ultimate item, I feel like it would be a pretty missed opportunity. I mean, yeah, it takes forever to get the treasure moved. Maybe they could have made it closer so it didn't take an entire in-game day to do it. That's annoying, I guess. But like, it's the ultimate thing, it's optional, and it's just cool in like a childlike way. I just don't agree with this. This is an opinion difference, obviously.
You're not gonna get 100 purple Pikmin over the course of playing the game normally. Even if none of your purples die along the way, there just aren't enough candy pop buds when you play through all the dungeons for the first time to reach this number.
It's really funny to talk about how much effort he had to go through to grind for a bunch of purples, while treating them like they were just plentiful and all over the place and you could just kill anything and everything and it wasn't really a big deal. He just contradicts himself every other sentence. I'm not sure how well I'm demonstrating that in this. I didn't want to script this because I knew this was going to be hell to watch, but yeah.
Who the f thought this shit up? Turn on your location. I just want to feed you to a burrowing snack rat. This one treasure makes it so I never want to lose a single purple because it might mean an extra trek through 8 floors of the goddamn subterranean complex that I've already beaten. Essentially, every time I lose a purple on one of these dungeon floors, I just reset because doing the floor over again is far less painful than the slog of trying to get that purple back later. And if none of your purples die, which none of mine did thanks to the handy dandy reset button, you'll still only have around 65 purples.
So no wonder he was frustrated. He relied so heavily on resets that he literally says that he reset every single time a single purple died because of how irritating it was and how few and rare and hard it was to get purples. So For him, of all people, to treat purples like they're this infinite, unkillable force is just so silly. It's so silly. How does he not see, even from an optics perspective, how this seems to be kind of going in its own point?
And sure, the Doomsday apparatus isn't required to beat the game, but if it's a Pikmin game, I need 100% completed. I'm sorry, that's just how I am. I need the Piklopedia filled out no matter the cost.
I mean, that's fine, but I do it because I like Pikmin, and Pikmin is good, and, yeah. I don't know why he's doing it, but yeah, that's fine if you want 100% it. I like 100% in games that I like because I like them and it's fun to do it, not because I have to endlessly reset and I get frustrated every time that I have to redo something. I generally do it for games I like.
So yeah, this single treasure has a huge detriment on the gameplay since it forces you to be paranoid about your use of purples and make sure that none of them die.
So, this is a level of ridiculousness. He's saying that it's a huge amount of detriment on the gameplay that you don't have very accessible purples, because there is an optional treasure that most people won't know even exists until the end that requires 100 purples, and getting 100 purples is difficult. Now, I think you can probably get 100 purples just from grinding in less than an hour if you want to do it from like the subterranean complex, which is something he mentions. That is less time than he likely spent grinding for bitter sprays for literally no reason. So if he's willing to grind for bitter sprays and he says that that breaks the combat, but then he's not willing, it's just like it... Oh my gosh, I just hope for people who've actually played Pikmin 2, they see how many times he's going in loops around his own logical train of thought, and how much he actively contradicts and leaves out and then mentions and then leaves out things that conveniently contribute to his point, while ultimately contradicting himself constantly. It's making my brain like a egg on the Texas sidewalk.
And if this discourages you from using the purples in combat in order to preserve them, then congratulations! Your reward is dealing with some truly nightmarish enemies without your greatest asset against them. Oh, but don't worry, if you don't want to use your one purple automatic win button, you can always use the other one. Turn them to stone and kick their asses. Who gives a shit anymore? Why is this game like this? I don't want to play it anymore. Can we just stop? Can we let
Please stop. Please never play any good game again.
Okay, let's stop the video. All right, that's enough. That's enough. I'm done. All right, we're done. The music and the graphics are really good and atmospheric, and the game is just oozing with personality.
The language doesn't really align with the final verdict.
The new Super Mario Bros. Series has often felt like a watered-down, more casual attempt.
Why is this game like this?
It's just a shame it doesn't push the system's visual or audio capability.
They go against practically everything I love about the Pikmin series.
It's a bit of a disappointment. Numbing, generic, bubbly music.
Now, these enemies wouldn't be the worst thing in the world, except some twisted f*** at Nintendo.
Playing with friends is still a bit of a chaotic mess.
But maybe all that means is that real-time strategy games aren't for them.
By the time Mario U really starts to do interesting things, it's over.
Damn, he fucking hates this shit. What the fuck?
It has a little something for everyone.
The music and the graphics are really good and atmospheric, and the game is just oozing with personality. It just doesn't live up to its predecessor or successor in my eyes.
He says he doesn't live up to the successor or predecessor, and I'm glad he doesn't do too many comparisons to Pikmin 1 and 3, but for him to say that as part of his conclusion while also making basically no allusions to Pikmin 3 and Pikmin 1, and also for many of his complaints in Pikmin 2 being more of a problem in Pikmin 1 or Pikmin 3, it just doesn't really work as a conclusion. He hasn't substantiated any of his points. He's basically just got mad about some things that aren't even necessarily true, and then said this is why it's the weakest.
When Pikmin 1 and 3 offer shorter but perfectly paced bursts of fun with no dull moments and impeccable gameplay.
Okay, so he says and impeccable gameplay, and then he shows the Pikmin 3 lock-on mechanic, which is fine. Once again, it makes the game easier and more accessible for younger people, but having a lock-on mechanic, it makes it, there's less gameplay. You hit the lock-on button, and then you hit the throw button, rather than actually having to position your throws and try to throw in a good place. In Pikmin 1 and 2, you can accidentally throw things into enemies' mouths. In Pikmin 3, you can't really do that because there's a lock-on.
Do you expect me to appreciate such a sloppy difficulty zigzag that violently swerves between being piss easy and unbearably difficult, when the other two games manage a much smoother difficulty curve throughout? You see why I consider this to be the black sheep of the main series?
I don't. I see that you don't like the dungeons, and then you twisted your body in multiple pretzels to try and justify why you didn't like those dungeons while actively contradicting yourself for 40 minutes.
But let me know what you guys think. I know this one is a lot of people.
Okay, so this is what I think. This Shafrillas video is dog water, and I love Pikmin 2. It's one of my favorite games of all time. Maybe I'll make my own Pikmin 2 video sometime. I know this was unscripted, so it wasn't nearly as, well, I'm so dead. I'm sorry. I am so dead. I hope you enjoyed. Thank you for getting to the end. Please donate to my Patreon. I do not make 360,000 views on every video, at least, that I upload. I do not have Skillshare sponsorships that give me thousands of dollars. I am poor, and please support my misery. Thank you very much, and I will see you next time. Kisses.
But it's still easy to tell that corners were a bit cut here.